Well, thank you, Alyssa, and thank you all for being here. Like I said, it's been a great partnership. Couldn't be done without all of you in attendance, so thank you very much. Like I said, or Alyssa alluded to, lots of good things going on in the county when it comes to America 250, their new exhibit. They're doing lecture series here, all around in the small villages as well, and at the parks. So make sure to get out there and enjoy your America 250 events. All right, without further ado, tonight we'll talk a little bit about labor. So in the last couple of weeks, we've talked a little bit about the beginnings of the Great Depression, how it affected the rural countryside, moved into the cities, and so on and so forth. But tonight we'll turn specifically to labor issues. So as we talked about, right, FDR takes over from Herbert Hoover in the election of 1932. In 1933, March 4th, he assumes office, right? And we talked about that 100 days were going to be very pivotal for the New Deal administration, right? FDR and his advisors are very interested in cranking out legislation. We talked about the executive orders that were signed, as well as using the Congress with that New Deal coalition to kind of jam through congressional bills. One of the biggest being, or the cornerstone or a foundational element of that 100 days, is going to become what is known as the National Industrial Recovery Act, right? And so in 1933, June 16th, FDR sits down to talk to the American people through one of his many fireside chats. And what he tells the American people on the eve of the passage of this new legislation, he argues that there is a need in the United States to focus on labor, and specifically industrial labor. And we'll talk about a little bit about why, that growing sector of the industrial economy. But he says, and I quote, "It seems to me to be equally plain that no business which depends for existence on paying less than a living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country." He goes on to say that by businesses he means the corporations and the manufacturing plants, and by working people he means everybody from your middle manager who wears a suit and tie and down to the farmer who wears his bib overalls. And he continues by saying, "And by living wages, I mean more than a bare subsistence level. I mean wages of a decent living," right? And so he's communicating this, and he's signaling to the American people that this administration is going to be interested in the conditions of working people in this country, right? More than the previous administrations, more than Hoover, more than Coolidge, and certainly more than Harding. And so this passage comes at a time, or this support of labor comes at a time when the support was at an all-time low. Right? Roosevelt's advisors are blaming the issues facing industrial workers and working people across the country on unrestrained competition, that the Hoovers, that the Coolidges, that the Hardings and their administrations had allowed business to run rampant, that there had been limited regulation, that the federal government has essentially allowed them to do whatever. And the people who suffered most are the people who are working in those factories, working in those positions, that their wages had stagnated, that their working conditions had deteriorated, and that they were not a good place. Not only are we strapped with economic difficulties, but now we have these labor difficulties added on top of it. And essentially, Roosevelt and his advisors hatch out a plan. What should the New Deal government's role be in protecting workers? Well, they say that it should be a national planning, that there should be some kind of vision for how the nation should move forward in terms of wages and working conditions. That there should be a little bit of limited regulation to allow businesses to work together to set minimum wage standards, to set maximum working hours, right? Things that we now all take for granted that weren't protected by the federal government before 1933. They wanted to allow or supported trade associations. Think the Motion Pictures Association, a conglomerate of movie makers that exists today. They wanted that for the industrial world, right? Automotive associations, where all of the automotive industries get together to set these standards, right? And they, importantly, and what will become the crutch of what we talk about tonight, is that they indicated a support for the democratization of the workplace, right? Big Washington, D.C. speak essentially means, right, that we want workers to have good working conditions, we want them to have better wages, and we want them to have security in their own workplaces. And this all comes on the backdrop of, in June of 1933, unemployment across the nation had hit its peak. About 25% or one-fourth of Americans were without a job. Right? This was affecting about 13 million Americans in a country with a population much smaller than today. It also comes at the chance of the passage of this legislation, the NRA, or the National Recovery Act, right? It's passed by Congress, supported by Roosevelt in 1933, June 16th. It's a key foundation, as we talked about, and what it's going to do is going to raise those prices on consumer goods to allow for there to be a raise in wages. They're going to allow businesses to price fix, to create a scarcity, to increase the price of goods, to therefore increase the wages paid to workers. They're going to try to do this to reduce unemployment. Again, FDR is saddled with this 25% unemployment. How do we fix this? How do we put more Americans back to work? And so it essentially has a few main functions. It provides for a minimum wage of about $12 to $15 a week, which in today's money is about $298, between $298 and $373 a week. Maximum working hours, 35 to 40 hours a week. Before this, it's 50, 60, sometimes 80 hours a week. It, for the first time in American history, abolishes child labor. It says that children in this country should not work, but instead go to school. Before this, the federal government had taken kind of a hands-off approach to child labor. The FDR's administration, the New Deal, says that in the industrial America of the future, this will no longer be an option. And importantly, for working people and unions, it's going to legalize collective bargaining. It's going to make sure that employers are not allowed to interfere with workers' abilities to create and join unions out of their free kind of will. And it's going to make illegal yellow dog contracts, which was essentially a staple in American industrial history, and where you could only be hired on the condition that you sign an oath that you will not join a union, you will not talk to a union rep, you will not do any of these, right? So FDR says if people want a union, they should have it. If they don't, they shouldn't, right? That the federal government should provide the protections, but by no means enforce unionization on workers. All right. So before we turn to this push, right, and I'll give you a little hint, 1934, the year after this legislation signed, there's going to be an upswell of unionization efforts all across the country. We'll talk specifically about Northwest Ohio. But before this, I thought it was interesting, or would be an interesting point, to turn to unionization and its kind of rates in American society before 1933, before the passage of the NRA. And so as I mentioned, before 33, there are no federal protections for workers, and therefore the country has low union membership, right? Mass unemployment and poverty of the Hoover years means that jobs are scarce and that workers that want better wages or working conditions are scared to try to unionize lest they be fired, right? There's a ton of people who would want your job, you deal in unions, you're fired, they replace you, no problems. Unfortunately, with many things in the New Deal, right, there are some pieces of legislation that are good, there are some that are bad. The NRA is almost universally bad, right? Historians and the contemporaries both note its failures, right? It's saddled with bureaucratic inefficiency, right? By the time that it's ruled unconstitutional in 1935, there's 30,000 unaccounted for complaints followed by workers across the country that NRA and its officials in Washington just couldn't get to. It encouraged monopolies by allowing those industries to form associations. It encouraged monopolistic practices. It reduced competition between the main producers. And importantly, it hindered small business who couldn't afford to keep up with the new regulations. It had limited economic productivity for the country, and its price fixing was kind of a disaster for people strapped without money. And again, as I kind of alluded to, it's ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Remember, we'll talk about it later, that Supreme Court operating during the early New Deal is going to be a thorn in FDR's side, ruling continually that, no, Mr. President, this is not the job of the federal government like they do with the NRA. They say that the powers of the federal powers outlined in the Constitution do not give you the right to interfere with business as the way that you have. What's important about the NRA, and what we'll talk about later, it does get replaced with something else, is the establishment of those labor standards. It sets those minimum wages, establishes the maximum working weeks, so people that are working those 60, 80-hour jobs can now work 35 to 40 and benefit from higher pay for less work. And it gives that protection to labor unions and that activity that follows in 1934. Of course, I'm a historian, so of course we have to go way back in history. I can't let you get out of here without a little context, right? But unionization is not a new phenomenon when FDR inherits this economy in 1933, right? Some of the earliest strikes in recorded American history happened before America was even a nation. 1619, Jamestown, a group of Polish craftsmen decide that, you know, if the English aren't going to give us the right to vote, we just won't work. And the English come to a conclusion that, all right, we need the Polish, and so therefore you have full citizenship and full voting rights, right? There's strikes throughout the 18th century, but what's most important about this long history of unionization in the United States is the events that happened during the 19th century. right? You have these 4 back-to-back strikes that are some of the most important in American history, right? The Great Railroad Strike, which is a national strike that shuts down the railroads across the country. President Grover comes in and says, no, and he sends in the army to shut it down. His justification is that by limiting rail, you're limiting mail. That's under my powers to ensure that the federal government is able to deliver its mail. You are not allowed to strike. The Haymarket Affair happens. It's workers at the McCormick Reaper, an agricultural manufacturing company that demand a 8-hour workday. There's strikes all across the country, and some anarchists in the crowd throw a bomb and unfortunately kill a few police officers in the ensuing kind of violence, right? And the U.S. government is going to use the Haymarket Affair as an order to crack down on unionization across the country. Same thing with the Homestead and the Pullman strikes, right? The federal government is going to use its power to dispel, right, these more radical elements among unionization in the United States. In the 19th century, it's mostly artisans. It's your blacksmiths, it's your cobblers, it's your craftsmen who are trying to unionize. They're skilled laborers, right? And amongst their ranks are radical elements. They're anarchists informed by the new literature coming out of Europe at the time. And so from the 19th century, right, it carries on into the 20th, Americans are going to have a really bad taste in their mouth when it comes to unionization, right? They're going to associate it with this violence that happens just the century prior. There's going to be some movements in the 20th century where people are going to demand or conditions are going to allow that maybe we should reconsider this opinion, right? The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911 kills, I think, I don't know the number off the top of my head, hundreds of people, right, in New York City where employers, to keep their employees, had locked the exit doors. A fire breaks out, they're not able to escape. Hundreds perish in New York City. Americans around the country say, absolutely, this cannot continue, right? 1919, the first peaceful strike in American history happens in Seattle. They shut the entire city down. It comes to peaceful terms, right? No intervention from the state or local governments, and the businesses agree to the concessions. And of course, in 1929, that decade before the Great Depression starts, the Battle of Blair Mountain happens among miners in West Virginia, in which the federal government and the Pinkertons, this kind of hired hand to crush unionization, it's very violent confrontation in West Virginia. Hundreds are injured. Yep. Oh, what was it? 123 in the Shirtwaist Fire. So these events, right, the Shirtwaist Fire of 100 people, the Battle of Blair Mountain, 100 people, right? There's bombs being dropped by private militias on top of miners, right? It gives people a pause to reconsider that, violence is coming from both sides. What do we do, right? And so this is where we move into 1933, and we'll first start with Toledo. In 1933, right, the NRA is passed, which gives workers this right, this protection to unionize. And uniquely, Northwest Ohio, where we live, becomes kind of a test case for what is going to happen with this new unionization efforts, right? We'll first talk about the auto light strike here in Toledo and then move down south to my home county of Hardin County. And we'll cover both the urban push for unionization as well as the rural. So to give you some context, we've talked goodness gracious, I can't use this clicker tonight. We talked very briefly, right, about Toledo in the past, but to give you some more context, right, Toledo is one of the hardest hit cities by the Great Depression across the whole United States, right? In 1931, there is the worst bank run in American history that happens in Toledo. Millions and millions of dollars are put away lock and key in the banks where depositors do not have access to their investments, right? It's mostly shady trading deals among Toledo bankers, that they were wheeling and dealing with people's monies. The Great Depression happens, catch everybody by guard. To not lose their own investments, they're going to lock depositors out of running on the bank, right? The Ohio Savings Bank falls in Toledo with almost $100 million worth of assets just in the city of Toledo, right? 9th largest bank in the United States in Toledo, one of the hardest hit. This causes, right, the blowback is severe, right? Toledo is one of the worst, if not the worst, hit cities. Unemployment in 1932 is 70%. Some estimates upwards of 80% of Toledoans are without a job in the city of Toledo. This is a city with an industrial base, right? A long time ago, people argued that Toledo was going to be the next Chicago, right? That it was on the lake, it had this access to railroads, it had this burgeoning industrial sector. The Great Depression is going to say, not Chicago, right? But it's going to get hit really hard. 70% is almost unimaginable, right, today. Oh, yes, this picture, So this is a shanty town set up on the Maumee River on the east side of Toledo, where there was hundreds of homeless individuals, families that were forced to live in these Hoovervilles, right, named after President Hoover that we talked about just a couple months ago. And so they were literally living on the Maumee River because there was, without access to those banks, without access to their money, without access to jobs, at 70% unemployment, there was nowhere else to go other than live on the river. It's estimated that 17,000 families in Toledo alone needed federal relief from the federal government, that without federal relief, that they weren't going to eat, that their children weren't going to go to school, and that they were facing kind of dire poverty. Because of this, the New Deal is going to act pretty fast in the city of Toledo. We talked about it last month, right, with all the WPA projects that come out of Lucas County, Toledo Zoo, the Toledo Library, the University of Toledo and their stadium, right? The federal government is going to dump millions of dollars into public work programs, try to lower that 70% down to a reasonable amount. Remember, in 1933, it's 25 nationally, 70 in Toledo. It's bad disparity. So they're going to try to lower that through public work programs. And importantly, for the Autolite, manufacturing of that 70% is hit hard, right? They're in that Toledo to Detroit to Windsor corridor, right? It's like the birth of the automotive industry. You have Willys Overland in Toledo, you have Ford in Michigan, and then you have the subsequent automobile factories in Windsor, Canada, right? It's this nice, perfect loop. We talked about it a long time ago, also a perfect loop for rum running as well. So the new cars that are coming out of the corridor are also transporting all that liquor downward, right? And so the manufacturing base that kind of holds Toledo's economy up is just kind of decimated by this rampant unemployment. And so a strike that's going to be very notable, one of the most important strikes in American labor history, is going to happen in the city of Toledo at the Toledo Autolite factory. Here's an advertisement from 1937 featuring Toledo Autolite. So what they manufactured were car parts, right? They were part of that very interconnected group of businesses that all supply the automotive industry. The same thing that we have today, right? Honda gets its parts from somebody else on down the chain. And so they manufactured spark plugs, ignition systems, starters, batteries, wires, right? They were in charge of the electrical components of cars. And their major suppliers were also those industries that were hardest hit. They have Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Willys Overland, right? So when there's this national kind of reduction in workforce, Toledo's going to get hit hard. And so Toledo, in particular, at the Autolite factory, is hit pretty significantly, and the Autolite workers are going to have a few main grievances with the management of the factory. The first is that they're going to say that there was limited wages, that the growth of wages was very small. In many cases, workers were predominantly women, almost half of Autolite employees were women, were tested or kind of watched of how fast they could produce the spark plugs, for instance, right? If you made more, you're paid per diem. Obviously, you're going to attract the motion studies individuals, this beautiful job that they created in the early 20th century to study workers, see who does it the fastest, and then set the fastest standard for everybody else, right? So you have to navigate this fine line between working not fast, and then you don't have any job, or don't work too slow, and they'll replace you with somebody else who can work faster. And so their grievance is the limited wages, but also those working conditions. In other cases at the Toledo Autolite factory, because so many people needed jobs, they would spread the work out. You would come to work for an 8-hour day, you would sit on a bench, you wouldn't get paid until they tapped you on the shoulder, said, hey, go make some parts. When you were done making the parts on that assembly line, go take a seat on the bench unpaid, and we'll tap you in again when we need you, right? So people are showing up to work, sitting around, twiddling their thumbs, maybe getting 4 hours of work in an 8-hour work week, or in a work day, and they're demanding that there be some more regimented hours, right? They're saying that the federal government now guarantees me an 8-hour work day. I want an 8-hour work day, right? I can't exceed 40 hours, but I should have stable kind of employment. And they also targeted the management of the factory themselves, saying that they were doing this on purpose to keep wages low, to keep people out of work. And so the first union actions that occur at the Toledo Autolite factory happen in February of 1934. It's called a recognition strike. Essentially, employees went on strike to get the company to agree that we are a union who can collective bargain on behalf of all its workers, right? They demand a 10% wage increase across the board for all workers, and out of 1,500 employees, 15 walk off the line at the Toledo Autolite factory in February 1934, excuse me. It ends after 5 days when the company agrees to across the board 5% wage increase for all its employees. It also says that on April 1st, 1934, we'll negotiate with you, we'll see what we can do. Of course, the 1930, yeah. I'm not familiar. Were they also in Toledo? It might have been interconnected. I know that, and we'll talk about it, a lot of the automotive industry in Toledo solidarily joins in with the Autolite. So Autolite only has 1,500 employees, but by the end there will be like 20,000 picketers. So it's a lot from the surrounding. But the Autolite strike in particular was just the Autolite factory. So this is where it starts, and it kind of snowballs out of there. So on April, yeah?
Would the practices with tapping the workers in, would that impact how much those factories would hire? Like how many people?
Yeah, absolutely, all interconnected.
Probably hire surplus
Yep,
people.
just to have people sit, and then, you got to call on the work time. Yep. Okay, so April 1st rolls around. Management says that we're going to try to negotiate with the union to finalize a contract. But at that negotiation table, they say, actually, we're not going to recognize the union at all, right? That we'll give you that 5% across the board, but we want nothing to do with unionized labor. And so on April 12th, a kind of second wave of the striking begins. 400 workers instead of 15 walk off the assembly line. And immediately, the Lucas County Common Pleas judge issues an injunction that says that there cannot be more than 30 picketers in front of the Toledo Autolite factory. In behind the scenes, which was not known to strikers and not released to the public, the Autolite management and the company begin slowly accumulating tear gas and riot gear, anticipating that the strike will become a point in which they need to use those materials. By May 23rd, right, so there is a little gap where there's not much. The union that is supposedly representing, right, it hasn't been voted on by the workers yet, has begun to enter negotiations with the Autolite management. But by May 23rd, it has snowballed that there is more than 10,000 picketers defying the injunction ruled by Lucas County outside of the Autolite factory, right? So we go from 15 the first time to 400, now we're at 10,000. Right, 10,000 people are gathered outside the gates of the Toledo Autolite factory to demand both recognition of the union and then to enter into negotiations and secure workers better conditions and better wages. What develops from here, from May 23rd until June 1st, is colloquially known and historically known as the Battle of Toledo, right? It's going to be one of the most important events that happens in the early Depression, and as we'll see why, right? So on May 23rd, right, the sheriff of Lucas County informs his deputies that they must begin arresting picketers outside of the Toledo Autolite factory. He says that the judge has ruled an injunction. They are in defiance of that injunction. You will arrest them. And so 5 are arrested of the 10,000 and taken to jail. As those men and women are being escorted to jail, the police get into an altercation with an elderly man and begin to beat him, and a crowd of 10,000, right? It takes one little flame to start a fire, right? So when they witness this, it is, for lack of better words, all hell breaks loose, okay? So 10,000 people, you have these sheriff's deputies, and the Battle of Toledo begins, right? On May 23rd, later in the evening, police officers pull out water hoses to spray the protesters, but because there's 10,000, they're able to grab the hoses and actually turn the hoses back on the police officers outside of the Toledo Autolite factory gates. Why they did this, I have no idea, right? Seems like a massive blunder. But because the workers are able to turn the hoses against the police officers are then forced into the Toledo Autolite factory, right? They're pushed back into the factory itself. They're inside there with replacement workers who have been hired by the Autolite factory, sometimes colloquially known as scabs, right, union terminology, are hired to replace those striking workers. And so inside you have this kind of powder keg itself, right? Outside you have a powder keg of 10,000. Inside you have a powder keg of all these replacement workers plus police officers that are now literally defending the gates, right, from the mob outside. Once the officers get into the Autolite factory here, they head up to the roof where that handy-dandy stash of tear gas that the company bought just months earlier comes into use, and the police immediately start throwing tear gas onto the crowd. In retaliation, the crowd throws bricks, stones, anything they can get their hands on into the Autolite factory, as seen here from this photograph. They also were able to, there was a dumpster nearby, set the dumpster on fire and wheel it right into the shipping department, and the building catches on fire. So the police stuck inside with these workers, right, are not only dealing with the barrage of stones and bricks, but also now an active fire, plus 10,000 people outside the gates. The factory manager at the time was actually in his office, and there's a picture that I didn't include here for lack of better time, but the office is just pelted with stones. There's stones everywhere, all over the desk. He was hiding under the desk supposedly and actually paid armed guards to escort him home because it got so bad. All right, so this is May 23rd. It continues into the night. You can see here another angle of the auto light factory. And in the evening, into the night hours, right, the crowd is actually going to push to try to break into the factory. The cops and the replacement workers are holed up in the factory. The strikers are going to try to force their way in. The police officers fire shots at the legs of protesters, which does nothing, kind of shooting at the ground, trying to ricochet up to get them to back off. One is injured, but not fatally or even that bad to begin with. They're able to push past the gates into some of these doors. Hand-to-hand combat ensues between cops and strikers. The police are able to kind of push them back, but the strikers try to break in 2 more times before eventually dispersing for the night. Now, on May 24th is really when the ramp-up of the Battle of Toledo is going to begin, right? Governor of Ohio at the time, a gentleman by the name of George White, is phoned up on the horn by the management of the Toledo auto light factory, and they essentially say, we have a situation here. We are requesting that the Ohio National Guard be deployed to the city of Toledo. Governor White, at the time, I believe a Republican, is interested in maintaining order in the state of Ohio, right? There's this looming threat of unionization around the country. He's interested in not making Ohio the test case for this. It's going to backfire, of course. But so he sends 900 National Guards troops from Columbus into the city of Toledo. Because of the kind of shortage of jobs, some of these National Guardsmen are going to be teenagers. They're in high school. Right? It's employment, and so you have very young, not all of them, but some of them, right? Very young National Guardsmen that are now handed rifles and tear gas and sent into a crowd that they've never been in before, right? Crowd control. These are not professional soldiers, all of them. Many of them had served in World War I. Many of them had not, right? They had not seen this kind of combat. Of the 900, the Ohio National Guard sent 8 rifle companies, 3 machine gun companies, and a medical unit, one. The troops, when they arrived at 5:30 in the morning, were able to clear a path through the protesters, get into the factory, allow them to relieve the police officers, replace the local police with the National Guard, and allowed the workers, the replacement workers that were trapped inside, to go home. And so now at this point, the Ohio National Guard has taken control of the Toledo Auto Light Factory. But May 24th is going to be, again, a day of much violence, right? This is a picture from, I believe, Champaign Street. I didn't include the caption. Champaign Street in Toledo, right? This is a weapon of war that was used in World War I. Even the outfits of the National Guard, there was no money to update them. These are World War I battle outfits, right? Stationed in an American city, in a highly populous American city nonetheless, right? Machine gun units dispatched. The common pleas judge in Lucas County issues an injunction, a second one, right? It couldn't be more than 30 picketers. The crowd's grown to 10,000. He says no picketers at all can be in front of the factory, right? That the police and the National Guard have the ability to enforce an injunction that there should be no one in front of the auto light factory. The public and the strikers are going to ignore this entirely, right? They're not going to leave anywhere near the factory. Charles Taft II, which is the president of Howard Taft, his youngest son, is assigned and sent directly by President Roosevelt to be a mediator for the federal government, right? We have this tendency to think the 1930s, certainly the president didn't know everything that was going on. Oh, he absolutely did. That telegraph was clicking and the mail was coming. And so President Roosevelt, well, we'll see the connection between both Toledo and Hardin County, is getting daily updates on what is happening just in this little section of the state. So they send Howard Taft's son, Taft II, to be the special mediator. In the late afternoon, after the Ohio National Guard has taken control of the factory, 6,000 people gather outside of it. And at 10 p.m., the crowd begins to taunt and heckle and throw bottles at the soldiers inside. So later on the same day, May 24th, things are going to escalate quite fast, right? Because they're being heckled and because they're having rocks and bottles thrown at them, the soldiers are going to retaliate by throwing military-grade tear gas, into the crowd of 6,000. The crowd is going to, I don't know why they didn't learn their lesson with the hoses, pick up the tear gas and throw it right back into the factory. Again, you would think at sometimes they would click for somebody, right? So they throw the tear gas back in. This exchange of tear gas bombs is going to last for 2 hours. They're just continually throwing bombs in and out, back at each other. It was so bad that the National Guard actually couldn't go into the riot zone. There was too much tear gas. They didn't have masks. It was, they were just essentially putting space between them and the 6,000. But where things get really bad is that the Ohio National Guard says, okay, it's lasted 2 hours. We have this constant barrage of tear gas. Something has to be done. And so inside the higher command of the National Guard tells the soldiers to fix bayonets and that they were going to charge outside and push the protesters away from the factory. They do this in the late afternoon, but as they do a bayonet charge, the crowd of 6,000, which outnumbers them, at this time there was about 1,500 National Guard soldiers in the factory, is able to push them back. The soldiers take some hesitancy and they fire into the air to try to give it a signal that, hey, we're not messing around, this is live ammunition. The crowd does not relent, and that's when the National Guard soldiers fire into the crowd of 6,000. 2 individuals are killed. 27-year-old Frank Hubry is shot 4 times by the National Guard. He dies on sight. And Stephen Saigon, a 21-year-old Toledo resident, is killed as well. Right? Both of these people were not workers at Toledo Autolite Factory. They were just citizens of Toledo interested in the cause of the Autolite unionization effort. 15 residents in total in the afternoon of May 24th are going to be shot and receive gunshot wounds, some of them gravely injured, as well as 10 soldiers are injured by throwing bricks. This picture here during this battle, right, the subsequent shooting and killing of 2 unarmed Toledo residents, and the tear gas barrage is kind of known as the Battle of Chestnut Hill, right? It happens on this kind of segment of Toledo, right? And so this picture shows the National Guard actually moving troops that were injured out of that area and back to the medical unit. So May 24th, after the killing, obviously enrages many Toledoans, especially those working inside the Toledo Autolite factory. And on May 25th, the fighting continues into the morning. It lasts all night from 24th into the 25th. At that time, as I mentioned, there's 1,300 National Guard soldiers stationed within the city limits, not all of them in the factory, but around the area, the 6-block area around the Toledo Autolite factory. This is the largest buildup in peacetime of military in Ohio's history, right here during the Battle of Toledo. The factory management decided to close the factory and let it remain closed until the strike was over. They thought that if they weren't allowing replacement workers to go inside and replace the jobs of the strikers, that maybe the violence itself would kind of wind down, right? There's more room that we can everybody step back, take a breath, and start to negotiate. But at this time, right, we're taking steps to de-escalate. The rest of the city of Toledo is escalating, right? It comes out on May 25th that 51 of 103 unions in the city have decided or voted with their members to engage in a general strike, which is essentially the shutting down of the entire city, that every single unionized factory, craftsman, whatever, you name it, right, are all going to go out on strike collectively, that they're going to essentially shut the city down until some kind of outside pressure forces the business and the city to negotiate with the workers. On May 26th, it dies down a little, the tensions, right? 6,000 of those protesters are able to be dispelled by the National Guard by throwing of tear gas without further incident. Nobody is hurt. Taft, President Taft's son, sent by Roosevelt, enters into negotiations with the management of the Toledo Autolite factory, and he compels the union to actually drop their demands to 10% wage increase. He says, no more people should die. The president is very interested in your success, but your demands are too high. Reduce them to 10, maybe we can get somewhere. And so a few days pass as these negotiations between Taft and the company and representatives of the Federal Labor Union, who the Autolite strikers are through, right, proceed without much incident. But on May 29th, when it kind of hits a stagnant period in these negotiations, more bad news comes out of the city of Toledo. That number of unions interested in a general strike has risen to 68, and this really scares a lot of people. It scares the city leadership, but it also scares Governor White, who is asked by the president and founder of the Autolite Company to allow the National Guard to dispel the strike period, to take full control of the factory and do whatever means necessary. Governor White, taking the political backlash of sending the National Guard in period, says, I will not, but privately starts drafting a resolution to declare martial law across the state of Ohio. Taft, the negotiator, reaches out to Secretary Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor in Washington, D.C. She's an individual we talked about just briefly, right? Follows FDR from New York into the White House. She serves as the first woman ever, selected to a cabinet position, but also serves with Roosevelt from 33 to 44 when he dies, right? She's his longest ally, and he dispatches her across the country to deal with this. So Taft reaches out to Perkins, Secretary Perkins, and privately Taft contacts Roosevelt and decides that he tells President Roosevelt on the phone that you must take action on this now, that you have to take a statement on Toledo, that if you personally, Mr. President, don't say something, right, worse things are going to happen. Roosevelt has this kind of strategy of not interfering directly, and so he refuses but listens to Taft's kind of desperate plea. On June 3rd, right, this kind of worry of a general strike, this worry of continued violence really pushes people, especially the company management, to enter negotiations. And so on June 3rd, the company submits its final negotiation contract. It's ratified by the workers of the Toledo Autolite factory, and it says that all workers across the board will get a 5% wage increase, that there will be a 35-cent an hour minimum wage guaranteed, that there will be union recognition, that the Autolite will recognize the union as the sole kind of arbitrator for workers' grievances and demands. And most importantly, they agreed that they will rehire every single worker who went on strike. And this was something that Taft and Roosevelt kind of together pushed for. Maybe not so much Roosevelt, but Taft was very interested in. He said, to quell any future violence that this can start up, we're not going to make it part of negotiations, but you must rehire. And so they do. On June 5th, later in the day after the contract is ratified, Governor White out of Columbus withdraws all National Guard troops. And on June 9th, instead of that general strike where we're going to shut the whole city of Toledo down, the workers of the city say, why not have a parade? So on June 9th, 1934, 20,000 people show up to a parade in downtown Toledo to celebrate the victory of the Toledo Autolite factory, but also the city as general, right? That the labor stood together against all odds to secure a victory for its workers, right? And this is a picture actually from the Toledo Blade of workers at the Autolite factory following the adoption of the contract agreement. All right, so that's Toledo, right? And I said that there's going to be two. So to Roosevelt's chagrin, two big strikes are going to pop off in Northwest Ohio at the almost identical time, right? The second being in Hardin County, my home county, which is just an hour south of here. And so the Toledo Autolite factory is interested in industrial workers. It's represented by the Federal Labor Union, the FLU, which is a subsection of the AFL, right? Labor history is just tons of acronyms. I won't ask you to remember them, right? All you need to know is that the FLU also is going to represent farm workers in Hardin County. Same union, same goal, right? Get workers unionized. And so to give you some context, since this is a little outside of the local history, Hardin County, just an hour south, very rural. Inside of Hardin County, much like the Great Black Swamp, right, there's the Scioto Marsh. It's kind of this untapped wetland potential. It's drained. It has a very similar history to the Great Black Swamp, right? 16,000 acres contained in Hardin County, second largest wetland in Ohio history behind the Great Black Swamp, right? It's not a swamp. It doesn't have trees, and so it's really undervalued. So its history is a little delayed from the Great Black Swamp. But what's important is that because of the soil that's underneath the wetland, right? The wetland, I won't give you a science talk, but the vegetation dies, creates good soil. In this case, right, it's not clay, it's muck. This really organic, highly rich organic material, right? Some upwards of 50%, 60% organic material in the soil. Really good for specialty crops, specifically root vegetables, right? Carrots and primarily onions. And so onions become this kind of main commodity grown in the Scioto Marsh in Hardin County. They start growing them in 1887, and by the 1920s, it becomes the single biggest crop produced in the county, right? It is one of the biggest continuous plots of acreage in the United States dedicated to onions at about 8,000 acres, and it colloquially becomes known across the country as the onion capital of the world. They're shipping these onions, these yellow Ohio globes, to New York City, right? This interconnected railroad and shipping infrastructure of Northwest Ohio allows these onions to go to kosher markets in New York City, in Philadelphia and Chicago and things of that nature. And so it becomes very lucrative for the growers that are living in Hardin County, right? And here is kind of from some of my own thesis research, right? This ebb and flow of onion production in the United States. What they didn't, or in Hardin County, what they didn't know, right, is by draining the wetland, depriving it of its access to water, and then farming the same vegetable on the land over and over for generations, is that they were inadvertently damaging the soil fertility. Right? That they were ruining their cash cow by not providing it with the natural resources that it needs, right? 1922, ton of rain, really good onion crop, right? Didn't connect in anybody's head that the muck soil needs replenished by water to contain its fertility. 1925, severe drought, onions go whoop, right? This affects more than just the corn producers, the wheat producers, right? 1928, a maggot infestation in the onion supply limits their they plant a lot, they don't get a lot in return, right? This is leading, to this conclusion that not only do you have bad agricultural conditions soil-wise, right? Your soil fertility is in the tubes, your bushels per acre are down, all of this. You're going to get saddled with, in 1929, the Great Depression. And so growers in Hardin County have no preparation for this. And as you can see, throughout the early teens and into the 30s, onions are a very lucrative crop, right? Growers in Hardin County are making much more off onions than they would ever be making off of corn, wheat, soybeans, or oats, right? The predominant crops dominating Ohio at the time. So they associate these high prices with, we got the cash cow, let's just keep planting onions, don't worry about the, ecological devastation. And it's also because onions at this time don't have mechanized, equipment that allows them to be harvested. You have to hire the labor to pick, to weed, to plant the onions, right? The muck soil is not good with tractors. It's not, there's no equipment that is, an onion picker hadn't been invented yet. And so all these profits are also, right, if there was an asterisk, it would say, well, we got to pay everybody. And our soil's going down. And now there's a Great Depression. None of this really is into the consideration. Now back to the workers of Hardin County, right? I had to give you some of the context, but back to the workers, right? These are people that are way below the poverty line, right? This is a photograph from Hardin County from the Farm Security Administration. This is the housing provided to onion pickers by the growers. It's essentially a shanty, right? One room houses, no access to running water, no electricity. In many cases, you have multiple families, up to 13, 14, 15 people living in this shanty, right? Multi-family, not even of the same family, right? You have two families of onion pickers living together in these conditions. So there's extreme poverty, right? Many of these onion pickers were brought to Hardin County from the places that the growers ship their onions to. Kentucky, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, all coal mining regions of the United States. And the onion growers, with their demand for labor in the early 1900s, thought it's a great idea. We'll go to these coal mining regions, say we'll pay you more to pick onions than you could ever make mining coal, right? 25 cents an hour. Many of these families board the train back to Hardin County. When they get there, they bring all their belongings, right? It's a seasonal position when you're, a farm worker, right? Today's farm workers kind of move with the seasons, right? These people were coming for a job. They packed everything, their house, their livelihood. They arrive in Hardin County, only to be told that the 25 cents might have been a little bit of exaggeration. It's more like 12. And so these people move from these regions to Hardin County under false pretenses. Remember, there's no protections from the federal or state government that says that business owners can't do this. This is one of the things that FDR is setting to eliminate, right? And so they move their livelihoods. As a result, Hardin County has one of the highest rates of tuberculosis in the state of Ohio during the Depression. These people are living on wet soil in one-room school or in one-room shanties, right? Packed in there. Tuberculosis runs rampant. Hardin County has some of the lowest forms of education in the area of the marsh. Many children are receiving no more than a 4th grade education, right, when the national standard is an 8th grade education because they have to pick onions and work in the fields just like their parents. And importantly, right, nearly 33% of all that land is owned by 3 people, right? 3 of the biggest landowners are employing the vast majority of these pickers, and there is this high rate of federal relief among farm workers in Hardin County, and there's really a demand. So this is a graph that I accumulated through lots of old records, but essentially this is the yearly earnings of onion pickers in Hardin County, right? The majority were making less than $250 a year, almost 60%. Today, that's $6,200 for the whole year, right? Family of 10, 12, $6,200 purchasing power. 26%, right, we're making between $250 and $500. That's about $6,200 to $12,300. And only 14% were making more than $12,000 a year. Right? So starvation wages among these farm workers. And importantly, as I said, the jobs are seasonal. So they're making most of this money in the spring into the fall, and then the winters they're being left to their own devices. When federal investigators come into Hardin County, the growers are going to tell federal officials that, well, we were feeding them and clothing them and doing all of this. Well, the investigators found no evidence that this was happening, right? That they were proclaiming to the outside community that, we're giving them milk, we're giving them eggs, we're giving them clothes, they're just squandering it, right? there's a lot of times in the kind of community, there's going to be this association that these are coal miner people, that they're below us. A lot of Kenton, folk, which is the county seat of Hardin County. It's not very big, I'll tell you that. That's my home town, right? 7,500 today, even less then. Called them kinfolk, right? They made fun of the way they talked, the way they dressed, and their kind of high rates of tuberculosis. Yeah?
What are the three onion owners' names?
Oh, off the top of my head, one of them is Kimmery, which, to get into a point of what's my thesis, which will become a book, is that Kimmery moves up to Michigan, so that's a big name. The other one is Stambaugh. There's Stambaugh, who becomes the president of the National Onion Growers Association, that if you remember that Smoot-Hawley tariff bill, he testifies before Congress and asks for a tariff on onions that didn't backfire. That old story that we talked about. And then the other one was a conglomerate. It was a Scioto Land Company. So the three of those own 33% of the land. The irony of it that goes beyond this, the Depression, is that all of those guys, kind of destroy the soil, abuse the workers, go up to Michigan. They learned all their lessons, and they're now lauded in Michigan as very big conservationists of soil quality. So they use the muck in Hardin County. It's deteriorated. Michigan in the 1940s is trying to sell a lot of its wetlands off. These guys buy those wetlands, drain them like they did in the swamp, but they know the lesson not to deprive it of water, and so many of them were. Like Kimmery was friends with Gerald Ford. And he's like a state farmer of Michigan in 1955 and all this. So trying to talk their family, but they're not really interested in. Anyway, all right, great question. But so, yeah, wages are in the dumps, right? These people are, kind of universally lauded. Less than, for most people, right, $6,000 a year on a family of 12. This kind of equals the cents per hour, right? A day's work is pretty segmented. Most workers are working 2 times a week for about 12 hours a day. The vast majority are making 15 to 20 cents an hour, which is about $3.81 an hour, or $5 today, right? And so the vast majority of workers are making about $3 to $4 an hour, right? Purchasing power, unimaginable, right? Federal minimum wage in this country today is $7.25. And so it's well below that. And so because of this, the farm workers in Hardin County decide, like the Autolite workers in Toledo, that they're going to strike. They do this. They were angered by those low wages, those harsh working conditions, and the inconsistent working hours, right? They organized with the Federal Labor Union, same as the Autolite, and on June 20th, 1934, right, they formed their union. Around 400 onion workers leave the fields in Hardin County. The union leader is a guy that we'll become very familiar with, a guy named Oki Odell. He's a union organizer that was brought from West Virginia when they moved here, right? He worked a bunch of odd jobs, right? But he becomes the kind of main lead in Hardin County. Their demands were pretty simple. They wanted 35 cents per hour. They wanted an 8-hour workday. They wanted a time and a half for overtime. They wanted 2 times on holiday, right? Pretty standard package, I would say, by today's standards, right? 8-hour workday, maybe not the 35 cents, but the time and a half and double time on holidays, right? Since it's agricultural work, right, the days are going to be spotty depending on weather and things of that nature, and they do have to work holidays. They want to be compensated for that. Oh, I skipped too fast. This is a picture of the village of McGuffey with the strikers on June 20th, 1934, gathered in the village square to kind of kick off their strike. Yeah. It's like an evil album cover. So these are the Hardin County deputies. Obviously, Hardin County today is very rural, but even back then it was still very rural. And so they actually didn't have enough sheriff's deputies to cover a strike. And so they had the fantastic idea, the Hardin County Sheriff just deputized people in the community. Said, you want to be, they had preference for those who had fought in World War I, but no prior experience required. So if you want a Tommy gun, and you want to be deputized as a sheriff, join, right? Kenton has an armory. It's no longer active, but it was during this day. It was a stockpile of old World War I surplus that was held in Hardin County. So they have access to all these weapons, all this tear gas, right? Growers are in a better position than the management at Toledo Autolite. They are not going to recognize the union, and they immediately hire replacement onion pickers. The Hardin County Sheriff, as I said, they deputized 40. This is a picture of some of those deputized sheriffs outside of McGuffey, where the primary action is going to take place. And in fact, the county is going to pay the sheriff's deputies $3 a day to stop the strikers. And one striker, my favorite quote of the whole story, is that he says, the county was willing to pay sheriffs $3 a day to prevent us from making $1 a week. right? And so there's a lot of, people are angered by this, that the Hardin County Sheriff would be willing to pay these wages. Early June, really, there's little violence. Unlike the Autolite, which thing kicked off pretty quickly, it's really kind of back and forth, tit for tat, kind of more pestering than anything. My favorite is the biggest grower. One of the workers for him knew that he left the garage open at night, so he got in there and pushed his Model T into the river. Again, to probably, send a message, but it was, nobody got hurt. We're just going to push your car into the river. And so they do that. But it's going to get violent pretty quick, just as in the Autolite. And so the first wave of violence happens on July 19th, about a month after, just a month shy of the formation of the Union in Hardin County. There's a fight between 75 to 100 strikers and about 9 sheriff deputies, one of them being the deputy you see to my left, Vernon Goff. He's hit over the head with a billy club, and it cracks his skull and breaks his jaw. There's stones thrown by workers at the scab pickers, the replacement pickers, and intimidation to keep them from entering the onion fields. And what will become the long legacy of the Scioto Marsh onion picker strike is the use of bombs, right? And so there are no people ever charged for the use of explosives, but it's become a recurring theme. On July 19th, 2 bridges in rural Hardin County are blown up by TNT to cut off routes of the sheriff's deputies so they cannot move around the onion fields as easily. It's making their job more difficult. The second wave of violence happens the day after, on July 20th. The mayor of McGuffey, a guy by the name of Mayor Ott, turns on the lights in the village of McGuffey. You might think, well, all the lights in the village come on. Well, in rural America, they turned the lights off in the villages at night at the beginning of the Depression and never turned them back on to save money. But Mayor Ott said, we can't have union organizers running around in the dark, flip the lights back on. And so this really enrages some of the strikers, right? That they're not only wasting the public's money on turning the lights on, but now they're trying to dissuade us from ever being able to meet in public freely. Mayor Ott's wife is also the sister of one of the largest growers in the marsh. And while Mayor Ott at first was in support of the farm workers, he quickly changes his tune, probably because his wife is yelling at him that, hey, you can't be, our family money is from the growers, right? We can't be on the side. And this is going to come into play later. The Scioto Marsh Land Office, right, that's that big conglomerate of landowners we talked about, its headquarters is blown up in the middle of the night by unknown vigilantes. But the real crown jewel of the Hardin County onion picker strike comes on, it's about a month later, right? There's this lull in violence when in the early hours of August 25th, a nitroglycerin bomb is detonated out of the side of the house of Mayor Ott, and it makes front page New York Times, the front page of the New York Times. The New York Times, in its main article on the front page, writes, "A day of violence, including the bombing of the mayor's home, the clubbing and kidnapping of a union leader, and the virtual seizure of the town for hours by anti-unionists, brought the Scioto Marshland onion strike to a crisis tonight." So Mayor Ott's house is bombed. Luckily, nobody is killed. He was inside with his wife and his dog. Their daughter was at a summer camp. The bomb actually explodes right outside of her bedroom. So if she would have been there, she would have probably been killed in the explosion. Afterwards, in the hours, right, anti-union vigilantes, right, those opposed to the onion workers' strike, storm into the city of McGuffey, between 300 and 400 of them, and they essentially seize the town. They drive up and down the street with shotguns and billy clubs. The sheriff is going to arrest Okie Odell, that union leader that we talked about, under suspicion of knowing something. They take him to the sheriff's office, they hold him on arraignment, and then their story is that they let him free on his own recognizance. His wife later tells the Toledo News that that's not the case, that the sheriffs beat the hell out of him, opened the back door of the sheriff's office where a mob was waiting. They beat the hell out of him, throw him into the back of a car, drive him across the county line, dump him in a ditch, and essentially tell him, okay, Odell, if you ever come back here, we're going to kill you, right? His wife at the time is interviewed by local reporters who said that the anti-union vigilantes had essentially were telling her that her husband had already been lynched, that he was dead, that it was over. But Okie Odell is an interesting character, and he is not killed or lynched. And in fact, he picks himself out of the ditch, walks about 20 miles back into the city, McGuffey, in tombstone fashion, walks right down Main Street and says, if they want to kill me, they know where the hell I am, walks upstairs of his house and brandishing 2 revolvers and essentially sits there the rest of the day waiting for the mob to come get him. They never do. Right? But this is really, right, August 25th is when the strike is going to end, right? The growers after this are going to absolutely refuse to enter into any negotiations with the union. President Roosevelt and Francis Perkins send some negotiators, but the job is already done, right? The bombing is what cements that the union will not get a victory, right? The growers ultimately refuse. Federal government can't pressure them into giving any concessions, and in fact, the growers go ahead and hire the replacement workers as permanent employees for 25 cents an hour, effectively ending the union, ending the strike with no victory, no concessions, right? Okie Odell moves on. We lose record of him in the history completely. I have no idea where he went, what he did. He dies in 1963. His wife lives until 1999, where Toledo celebrates the Toledo Auto Light Strike and the Scioto Marsh Strike in conjunction, and she's the main procession at the Labor Day Parade in Toledo. And so there's lots of kind of evidence there, right? But the onion picker strike is happening at the same time, right? All of those reports that are going to Washington are talking about, in conjunction, auto light and onion pickers. You have urban, you have rural. And in fact, there's some kind of conversation between them. The auto light strikers are sending their lawyers to defend the onion pickers in Hardin County. The onion pickers really can't send them anything back, but they're happy for the support, right? So these two are working in conjunction together. One is successful, one is not, right? And this really, the beauty of it, this doesn't happen much in history, is an allegory for what comes next. It tells you what's going to happen. And so because of those strikes of 1934, auto light being one of the most important, right? It's the first time that the automotive industry has this big unionization push. Because the auto light factory wins, Minneapolis goes on general strike at GM, they win, right? There's tons and tons of strikes across 1934, all of them in that automotive industry, that fastest growing industry of the 1920s that was left wide open. There was no unions, right? All of these look to Toledo as a test case that we can do it, we can have the government on our side, and we're able to win negotiations, right? The highest amount of strikes happened in 1934. It's because of the passage of that National Recovery Act. But it's ruled unconstitutional in 1935. But FDR has the New Deal coalition in Congress, and he says, okay, I'll just write a new bill. And they do, and it's called the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, or National Relations Act, which becomes the board, right? And essentially what it says is that all of those things that the Supreme Court said was unconstitutional, we'll change the wording a little bit, and make it kind of acceptable to SCOTUS. And they do that. Right? It provides those protections for unionization. It provides the access to collective bargaining. It allows those industrial workers to join freely into a union. It says the employers cannot interfere. But what it does is it excludes farm workers. Farm workers are ineligible from any federal protections under the federal government's new law. Right? Industrial workers, the victors of the twin strikes in Northwest Ohio in 1934, all the protections you want. You can unionize however you like. The losers, the ones in Hardin County, there will be no protections from farm workers. In fact, today there are still no protections under the NLRB for farm workers, right? The only exceptions to this law are government employees, supervisors, contractors, and farm workers, right? And so really, Northwest Ohio becomes a test case. One is a victor that leads to more successful organizations in the automotive industry and the industrial sector, right? They get the concessions from the federal government. The other, in Hardin County, the loser, they get no concessions. Farm workers really don't have unions until 1960s with the rise of Cesar Chavez, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, right? And so there's a long history between the two, right? And so while the NRA had many, or NIRA, right, had many failures, the NLRA, this bill right here, passed in 35, to meet the conditions of the Supreme Court, is about universally lauded as a fantastic legislation of the New Deal. But again, farm workers, like as farmers were forgotten in the 1920s, farm workers are going to become the forgotten people of the New Deal as it moves on. We'll talk about this later with sharecroppers in September, right? But there will be no protections from FDR's administration for any of these individuals. And so that's what I got. Those are the twin strikes, right? It gives us a good look at what labor is like in that early depression as we move, closer and closer to the end, right? We still have many lectures to go. Next month, we'll talk about ecology. We'll talk about the Dust Bowl and the Navajo Livestock Reduction Program. As always, there's some book recommendations for you. I always leave you with homework. And I'll take any questions, and thanks for being here.